Okay, I guess today I want to do a video about spring stacking, why you do it, some parameters that you have to consider when choosing springs and the rates and everything else. So let's talk about some spring stacking. I've spent the last 30 plus years working on race cars, building race cars, and racing cars. And I'm here to help you better understand racing technology. I guess the first thing you got to remember or learn or consider, I think, is why you'd want to stack and what the choices are and how you think about the things. Just like there's a relationship between your right rear and right front tire as far as how the car turns loose and tight, there's also a relationship between your left rear tire and your right front and how it powers tight. So I guess there's two schools of thought on this, and a lot of it has to do with driving style and tracks and track conditions between whether you go with a stack spring, conventional spring. My thinking as of right now is these things are losing so much traction in the front, they're getting what people call aero tight. But I almost think that they're getting too stiff in the front, where the aero tight is if you take the air off the nose and the suspension is too stiff, all it's doing is skidding across the track or bobbling, and it's actually taking traction out of the front end. Those front end tires have a certain amount of steer grip in them. As you turn them left and you're trying to go in there, the tire stretches. Well, when you start bouncing on the tire and you take the weight off that tire and you're using a tire as a spring rate instead of a traction deal, it's going to make the car too tight or skip. So there's a fine line on that right front as far as bottom spring rate. Right now, my thinking is, and I'm looking into some things, is about a 500 pound or even a little bit under 450 pound final spring rate up there, so you can keep the amount of stretch in that sidewall tire and keeping that thing steered good, but yet you'll still have some wedge there to push on with a 500 pound spring to get you nice through the middle and off the corner. I mean, the way we're running our cars now, it only makes sense to me to get a stack spring deal on the front so you get that easy attitude. The car gets down where it wants, but then that final spring rate needs to be, like I said, between a 400 and 500 pound deal. Enough to keep good drive in it, but yet not enough to shear that contact patch. I guess the first thing you got to consider when you're thinking about spring combinations and stacking is the free height of the spring. Spring manufacturers now are coming up with a lot of different free heights, spring rates. I mean, it's way open from what it used to be when I started playing with spring stacking. I mean, we only had a very limited amount of springs to choose from. It always seemed like Eibach had like the biggest selection. I love Eibach springs. I love Hyperco springs. I love Eibach springs, and I love Swift springs. Those seem to be like the biggest contenders right now as far as I see. I'm sure there's other ones and people have their opinions, but that's just the kind of the three that I like to work and think around. I guess one thing you really have to think about with the free height of springs, actually two things. One is a coil bind height. You don't want to get something too soft where it's going to coil bind, and your final coil bind height of all those springs stacking together there is going to give you not enough travel onto the right front. Another thing to consider is how far the spring is up on the shock body. Now there's some manufacturers that are making short body shocks with longer shafts, so you get all that travel. But then you got to look about that threaded area. If you're going to stack a spring, you got to think about the total free height in both of those springs and be able to put a lockout in there and an adjuster nut on there on the top. So the free height on springs is critical. Anywhere from an 8 to a 10 inch sometimes. It depends on the rates and the heights and how everything works there. But always consider your heights. When you start looking at spring stacking charts for, I guess, final spring rate and how this whole thing is going to work, look at the spring rates you're looking for and looking at the heights that they offer. I didn't always say I'm only running Hyperco or I'm only running IBOC. It was always a combination of what I could get where and how they all fit with free heights and final spring rates. I think those three are all good springs. It's just a matter of who offers what and what you can get. Some of them, I've been in situations where a new spring comes out, it's what I want, it's very popular in the country, and you can't get them for 2 months. Well, that's why I really look on availability, where you're going to order from, how fast can they get it. If it's back ordered, there's a ton of parameters with trying to get springs. So the point I'm trying to make is you got to use all your resources possible in figuring this whole spring stacking scenario. A lot of chassis manufacturers or shock guys will set you up with put a 200 over a 5 or whatever it is that they do. And you can go online and you can find out exactly what the final spring rate. I think Swift has one, Hyperco, maybe even IBOC has one, but I know Swift and Hyperco have spring stacking charts. There's probably a ton of them out there. And you just go in there and you can look at one spring and look at another spring, and this is your final rate on the springs. I always tried to get on the right front as soft as I could on the final rate so that car would tip over there and you wouldn't need as much rebound to keep it there. But then a lot of times we'd run a packer at the bottom or some sort of a rubber deal in there, and we'd set it not only on a spring, but then you'd have a bump stop up there inside the spring that you'd set it on. So basically, even if your bottom spring was 500, once you set it on that bump stop and that bump stop raises that 500 final spring rate up to 1,000 or 900, or if they have 1,000 pound bump spring we've played with too, that's your final spring rate. And if that final spring rate is too stiff, I think it's starting to shear the tire. On the right front, another thing you have to think of is your top spring height. That's critical too, because you only have so many threads there, so much thread on your front shock body. And you have to put a adjuster nut on there, you have to put a lockout ring on there, and you have to put a lockout nut on there. And you don't, I've done it where we've coil bound that top spring, and it actually adds, it actually acts as your kind of your lockout. It was a weird deal, the one we did. But you have to take the consideration on what that top spring is, the free height that you can get in there with all those pieces in there. We are really limited with our shocks, the way the guys build them. I'd actually like to see a shock body on a late model now threaded all the way down. I think a lot of them leave a good amount of gap at the bottom. Maybe they're making some now and I don't know about it. But all the ones that I did back in the day, or even the ones that I deal with on a car now, there's like 2 inches that isn't threaded there. And just for sake of experimenting, I'd love for that to be threaded all the way down to the gland nut or the top nut on the shock. Another big plus that they're doing now with this shock stacking deal, I don't know if it's widely known or if some people know about it, some people don't, but your standard shock on your right front is a 7-inch shock. That's pretty much what everybody goes to. But they're making now a short body with a longer shaft, and it's actually to get more drive and allow more clearance for that thing to go. The problem with a longer shaft is you can't, it has to be with a remote reservoir, because then if you're not dealing with a remote reservoir like you are in a late model, if you're dealing with a mod shock and you try that, you have everything like a base valve up there, you got your floating piston or bladder, and that's also a nitrogen chamber up there. So you're probably not going to get the amount of compression you need on that right front by sticking all that stuff up there with a long shaft. So shock design choice is also a big deal up there. If you run a bulb shock on the top like a modified always does, like I said, you're limited. I love base valves, but you're limited because once you put a base valve in there, then you need room there to put, fluid on top of that base valve, and then you need some sort of a bladder system or a floating piston in there, and that detracts the amount of room that shock piston shaft can get compressed into that shock. Another thing you have to kind of consider when stacking springs, and it comes down to a whole package. You're not just gonna go for initial spring rate. You're not going to go just for final spring rate. You have to think about this with a package on how much rebound is in that shock and how the shock rebound valving is as opposed to what the bottom spring is. I mean, if I were still doing shocks, and I don't do shocks anymore, I mean, if a guy goes basically from a 400-pound spring on the bottom to a 500-pound spring to a bump stop to a bump spring, that will change your rebound setting that you're going to want to do in that shock. The spring should be matched to the shock valving, and I think that's not what a lot of guys do now. But if you are going for the ultimate and you are going to be the fastest, you're gonna want to think about that rebound shock valving and even the compression valving a little bit, but more of the rebound when you go to change springs up there. So then when you stack a spring up there and you're going from like a 200 top to a 500 bottom, you have your final spring rate. But if it's too harsh and you go to set that thing down, unless you keep that 200-pound spring on top totally locked out the whole time you're on the track, and you get to a point where that thing floats up through there, you're going to hit a deal where it's going to sit down on there and it's going to lift up a little bit, and then you're going to hit your mid corner maybe. It'll sit back down there and the car will shove. The car will be very erratic. So that's another thing you really have to consider is if you are going to keep that top spring locked out the whole time you're racing, that is a good thing. If it all flowed off of that top spring or off that adjuster, like I said, if you get too big a difference between your top and your bottom, it'll hit and it'll get real harsh and hard to drive and very erratic. We were doing it years ago where we played with it quite a bit, and we did a practice session. I had a very soft top and we had a very stiff bottom, and it was so harsh that the car would actually float up as a long straightaway paperclip half mile. And the car would actually float up a little bit on the straightaway off that right front lockout because we didn't have enough rebound in it. This was back in probably the mid 2000s, early to mid 2000s. The car would float up off of that lockout because I didn't put enough rebound into it, and the car would actually porpoise and move around. Talked to another driver, and another driver said, just put a really stiff shock up there. Driver was Darren Miller, and he was really big into shocks. He said, oh yeah, that's porpoising. He said, just put a really stiff left rear front in there, and that'll take out that porpoising effect that's going on down the straightaway. And I'm like, I shot him some numbers at like an inch or two a second. He said, no, double that. And I freaked out because I had never built anything over 100 pounds of compression at 1 inch at that time. So we did it. I built a shock, and it did cure the porpoising. But now looking back on it and all this big rebound stuff we have going on now, I think if we could have definitely cured the porpoising effect by just adding more rebound to the right front. Stacking left fronts is something that I've played with, and at this point, I don't think we'd go back. When I first did it, I thought this is a great idea. Get the front end tucked down, and I had a driver from Australia and a friend named Glenn Seaton. They came over and they ran some cars, and Glenn Seaton said, I wouldn't do that. The car gets kind of goofy. And Jamie kind of said the same thing. You stack the left front, and it sounds all well and good, but the car gets loose and just doesn't drive well. Well, I always liked experimenting with things, so I tried it on a different car, and sure enough, my good idea didn't work out so well. The car was just goofy and erratic and loose and just wasn't a good thing. So the left front, I don't think at this point I would work on a spring stacking deal. Basically, the theory at the left front is the bigger the spring, the more side bite off the gas and the more side bite is, because the same thing that happens with the relationship between your left front and right front is happening with the relationship between your left front and your right rear. They both go diagonally. So when your car rolls in the corner, the stiffer that left front is, it'll actually roll and push weight and hold that, I don't know, I call it like a reverse wedge or whatever, on that right rear and pins that right rear hard. Another thing is if you want to free the car up, that left front spring is very helpful in freeing that car up. Go down to a 500, go down to a 450, 400. But watch out, because you'll get to that tipping point where that that left front gets too soft, and it'll just make the car really loose. So anywhere between a 4 and 550 is kind of the range I always like to think in with that left front spring rate. But I definitely would not recommend stacking a left front. Maybe in the futures, if I get thinking about it more and I create an entire front end package where I know that left front will never come off of a lockout deal, then maybe. But at this point in time, I don't think I'd play with stacking a left front. When we are running our swing arm stuff, I did kind of play with the idea of stacking a right rear. And the whole motive behind that is not soft to get it to lay there or anything. My whole motive is if like the right rear is heavy and you're laying on that spring and all of a sudden you start hitting holes, I wanted that right rear tire to dig itself out of holes. So we'd actually stack them so you'd have a standard spring rate, but then we'd lock it out so if that tire got dipped down into a hole, you'd hit a stiffer spring and it would dig its way out of the hole. That was kind of my right rear thing. We played with it a little bit. Never really found anything there. So I think if you're going to play with the right rears, don't stack it. Put your standard 250, 200, 2 1/4 on the right rear, whatever you normally would run for a straight rate spring on the right rear. I don't think I would stack them at this point. With the left rear now, everybody's going to kind of like a reverse lockout deal where the lockout ring and everything goes underneath on top of, and you can actually adjust a preload onto that left rear spring. And the Droop preload is what they're calling it, or Droop load, or whatever everybody wants to use for terminology at the time. But it's actually, you can adjust that. So you have to think about how much shock distance you need there. You know, your spring indexing on your bird cages comes into play because you don't want any binds there. You want your left rear suspension very, very consistent on your droop. You want to set that with your chain or whatever you do, but that has to remain a constant. So you have to think about your droop loads, and it's not only if you're figuring this stuff out and you don't have a chassis manufacturer you're working with on this stuff. Think about this too, is when your chain is there and your right rear is compressed and your left rear is at droop load, your shock will be a different length than if you just jack your car up. That's what I think bites some people when they figure droop loads is the distance in from your tire is where that chain goes. Now, if your chain goes, in further and the pivot point is here and your tire's here and your right rear compresses, you're going to get a lot more lift out on the track with that left rear than if your chain, and when they jack it up, that droop load is closer to the tire. So that all has to be taken into consideration, all these parameters when you're figuring your droop and your droop load, and everything else is figuring out where that chain pivot is in relationship to that right rear tire, because your car will be squatted on the right rear. So if the chain is further in, it will actually act as a pivot and you'll actually get more drop on that left rear than if that chain was closer to your left rear tire. Okay, my plan was actually to have a shock here and actually show you when I shock some things, but I didn't get the shock. So let's go over to the drawing board again. We'll do some diagrams and we'll look at some different factors so you get a better visualization of what's actually going on there. Okay, first I wanted to define a little bit exactly what some of these pieces are. Most of you probably know how a stacked spring deal works, but for those who don't, this is what it is. You first have your bottom cup where your spring goes. Your first bottom spring will go right here. This is a separator ring, and the spring will go from here to here. Your top spring will go from the separator ring to your adjuster nut. What happens is when your shock shaft compresses, when it compresses far enough, this separator ring hits the lockout nut, and it actually locks out this top spring. So your final rate then will be this bottom spring. Whatever this is, it acts as a single spring. So that's basically what's going on with your typical lockout stack spring deal. We have done it on some swing arm stuff where we didn't put the lockout nut in there, and we just stacked those springs for a softer rate. It was kind of before they really got a lot of springs made and we had a lot of heavy stuff, so I'd stack a couple springs together, put it on the left or swing arm to make that swing arm spring rate softer to get more traction. But that's actually what's going on with the adjuster nut and then the lockout nut and everything else with the separator ring. Now there's usually not that big a deal with it because mods don't stack springs. But when you get into a deal where you have a bulb top and you don't have, or even like an IDA, this is why we don't run IDAs on late models on the right front, because it limits the amount of area you can actually put two springs in. The bulb is so big. You have a base valve in here, you have your shock piston, and you'll have a bladder in here in the IDAs. So there's not enough room. Your threaded area here gets real small. The threaded area on a non-bulb shock is much larger. This is what's going on in a remote reservoir shock. It allows the piston, because your base valve and your floating piston or bladder is in the nitrogen chamber here, it allows you a lot more travel to your shock piston. So you don't have all this stuff up here to limit travel. So that's the ideal thing why we run remote reservoirs on a stack spring deal like on the right front, is to get all that stuff out of there and allow you a larger threaded area to put the second spring and the lockout nut and the separator ring and everything else in there. So that's why we run a remote reservoir, either piggyback or a hose deal, either one. It's just to allow more travel and more room for springs. If you liked this video and you liked others too, subscribe to my channel and ring the bell for notifications. It really helps me out on this channel and I can keep making videos. Then the notifications aren't anything spammy. It's just basically when you come on YouTube and you're looking for some videos to watch, it just says, I have a new video. That's it. So subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. Have a good day and we'll see you in the next video.